Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're tuning into AMTV, Alternative Media Television. It is, of course, Thursday, July 31st, and stocks get slammed on Wall Street today on gross deflation fears coming from Europe. And I want you to think about this for a minute. With the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 200 points and global markets skittish on gross deflation fears coming from Europe. Now, this should be absolutely amazing to you because we have had gross stimulus over the last 6 years. We've had 0% interest rates. We've had a liquefaction of our markets. We've had a Federal Reserve and an ECB overseas buying its own securities. We've had Europe taking rates negative, and the markets are crashing on gross deflation fears in Europe. Now, what is deflation? Well, it's the opposite of inflation. And of course, central banks, the ECB and the criminal Fed here in the United States, hate deflation. It reminds them of the Great Depression. See, if you think prices are going to drop, then consumers, Americans, Europeans, stop spending because obviously if they can buy goods and services, homes, real estate, pretty much everything cheaper in the future, or they expect it to be cheaper in the future, they hold off on their purchases. It's also more difficult for the federal government here in the United States or in Europe around the world to tax its citizen. It works in the opposite direction, and it also makes debt more expensive. It makes debt more difficult to pay back. And with record balance sheets here in the United States and in Europe and really abroad, that is a catastrophic worst case scenario for the Federal Reserve, and it's why they prefer to stoke inflation. It's why they've Ponzi schemed up our market to Dow 17,000. But what is amazing about this, folks, is we've always talked about this. I've always talked about this through the years, is market forces will finally come to play, and we will all pay the piper. All of this will come to roost, and we're seeing it now with the ECB imposing negative interest rates on their system and on their market, and markets crashing around the world on fears of gross deflation coming from Europe. I mean, if you can't get growth, if you can't get inflation on negative interest rates, and the ECB and the Federal Reserve pushing these unbelievable, never before seen in history stimulus packages, you know you have a serious problem. Of course, we're also having the trickling out of pre-Lehman type events, as we've seen and I reported on yesterday with the failure of Argentina failing to reach a debt agreement. Many thought that they would reach an agreement, but instead here, according to Reuters, they failed to reach an agreement, and of course a default looms. Argentina, of course, no different. Buenos Aires, no different from the United States balance sheet. No different from parts of Europe. We're just as bad, just as rotten, just as petrified in the inside from all this massive debt we've taken on over the past few years. In fact, the only thing that's been growing in this country, in the United States, and in Europe has been the debt. That's the only thing that's actually been working in a positive direction. And now stocks growing very wary after hitting all-time record highs on 0% interest rates here in the States and negative interest rates in Europe. And now the markets were worried about a gross deflation death spiral. We've talked about this for years, folks. We got the inflation. We got the inflation in commodities. We got the record bubbles. We got the Dow Jones at all-time highs. And now we have gross deflation fears. And all of this is a setup for the worst case scenario, the greatest of Great Depressions that already began in 2008, arguably before that crash and before that period as a byproduct of the Alan Greenspan years and the creation of a previous bubble, only to create an even bigger bubble through the Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen whoredom of the United States financial system, European financial systems, and global capital markets to pad the pockets of the elite and the wealthy before the greatest crash of all time. I mean, it's so ridiculous now, folks, that not only do we have prognosticators like Art Cashin, who I follow for some time, saying the S&P 500 has to hold 1950 or expect a worst case scenario, we even have scumbags like Alan Greenspan that caused the first collapse in 2008, saying equity markets are going to friggin' tank. They're going to crash. Equity markets will see a decline at some point after rising for the past several years, former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan said in an interview on Bloomberg TV. The stock market has recovered so sharply for so long. Yeah, thanks to you, asshole. Thanks to your policies. Thanks to Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke, 0% interest rates and negative interest rates in Europe. You have to assume somewhere along the line we'll get a significant correction, Greenspan said on Wednesday. Yeah, significant correction means a stock market crash. You know, everyone thinks we're out of the woods. Everyone thinks and believes in the false reality that is Dow 17,000. Well, all of this is going to come to roost, and we will all pay the piper. Not the financial elites, of course. Not Ben Bernanke. Not Janet Yellen. Not Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase. No, not those scumbags. You. It's absolutely incredible. You know, I've talked about this for over 5-6 years now. I did a recent report on the financial crisis and ECB taking the interest rates negative to delay panic. Again, how prescient is this, folks? You know, I talked about this just a month ago, saying taking rates negative only proves how worried the ECB is because they know their economy actually isn't growing and they're not getting the inflation that they want. Instead, they're getting the reverse. They're getting the catastrophic reverse. They're getting deflation. Here we have the article, ECB imposes negative interest rates. Now, the reason they do this, again, folks, is because deflation is their worst enemy. Again, consumers stop spending. The consumer makes up 2/3 of GDP. When the consumer thinks prices are going to continue to drop, we saw this in real estate in 2008, everybody stops buying. And it also increases defaults. It prohibits and prevents the ability of the U.S. federal government and the Federal Reserve, the criminal Federal Reserve, from managing their massive debt load. It makes it more difficult to manage debt. It's exactly why they took rates to zero, because they're fearing what is actually happening now. And we're starting to get a taste of this straight out of Europe with gross deflation fears. And what do we have to look forward to, folks? Why would Wall Street be so worried? Because in a deflationary environment, it looks like the 1930s. It looks like the post-1929 stock market crash reality, a decade-plus long depression, followed by World War II, and a gross, unbelievably catastrophic period for the American people and largely people all around the world. This is what deflation looks like, folks, and it's going to be worse this time around because of the gross stimulus packages and this Ponzi scheming of our financial system. It'll be arguably far worse than 10 years, far worse than World War II, far worse than anything that we have ever experienced before because of these scumbags. And we are only just starting to get a taste of this, folks, after the Dow Jones and the S&P 500 hitting record highs. And we're already getting our pre-Lehman, if not our Lehman moments, with Argentina failing to reach a debt agreement and on the verge of absolute collapse and default. Again, remember how the contagion spread in 2008, folks? All banks, all financial markets, all countries are grossly interconnected here in the United States and in Europe. When one domino falls, every domino falls. And the result is this. This is the truth. This is the hardcore truth. This is the absolute truth. And I'm Christopher Green. Get it out everywhere. Make it viral. Hard-hitting and in your face, and click the link below to support our sponsor.